Welcome to Sarah Speaks. I'm Sarah, and today I'm speaking. This is the first talk on knowing Jesus, because I really have a drive to know Jesus better. And this Bible actually calls this story that I'm about to share. It calls it faith born in desperation. And it's a story that I've been looking at recently because I'm doing a series of talks in Australia next month, and this story has kind of come to the forefront of my mind. I've been thinking about encounters with Jesus and different women that encountered Jesus. Um, and this is a story that I've thought about a lot over the years. And like I say, faith born in desperation. So this is a story that is in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So it's actually recorded for us 3 times. And I think to me that really speaks to the importance of it, because not all stories, not all healings, or all parables are included in 3 or even 4 of the Gospels. So, yeah, like I say, I think it really speaks to the importance of it. I'm going to read this. This is from Mark, chapter 5, and actually I'm just reading in the New King James Version. They're all much of a muchness. Now, a certain woman had a flow of blood for 12 years and had suffered many things from many physicians. She had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, "If only I may touch his clothes, I shall be made well." Immediately, the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that power had gone out of him, turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples said to him, "You see the multitude thronging you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see her who had done this thing. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction." And I just love this. I missed out the verse just before it says, "Now a woman, certain woman." It says Jesus went with him. So this is Jairus, who's one of the rulers of the synagogue, whose daughter had become very ill unto death. And Jairus comes to Jesus and says, "Please, please, can you come, because I know you can heal my daughter." Now, incidentally, this is interesting. Jairus is coming and saying come on. And it says here, Jesus went with him, and a great multitude followed him and thronged him. So here we've got Jesus. He's on his way to the house of Jairus, who is a leader, right? He's actually one of the rulers of the synagogue, and so he would have been someone of high standing. "My daughter's sick. I want you to come." And then here, in absolute contrast to this, like a male Jewish leader, we've got this woman. She had a flow of blood for 12 years. Now, under the law, she would have been classed as unclean. And I know that it's very easy to kind of look at the Jewish law and be like, "Oh, how rude," like they're calling women unclean or people unclean if they have a discharge. I hate the word discharge, by the way. And so I'm going to read you these verses. So this is in Leviticus chapter 15, and it says, "When a woman has a discharge, and the discharge in her body is blood, she shall be in her menstrual impurity for 7 days." Right? This is important. "Whoever touches her shall be unclean until the evening." Now I'm just going to skip down there. It talks a little bit more about the uncleanness associated with basically your menstrual cycle. I'm skipping down to verse 25, right? Because this is what's relevant to this woman who had faith born of desperation. "If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, not at the time of her menstrual impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond the time of her impurity, all the days of the discharge she shall continue in uncleanness. As in the days of her impurity, she shall be unclean." Now, we've read here that whoever touches her, this is in verse 19, where it's just talking about when you've got your period. If you touch a woman who's got her period, right, it says here, you'll be unclean until the evening. And I skipped over some bits there, but here's the relevant part for someone who's bleeding all the time. First of all, if someone else touches her, they're classed as unclean until the evening. Also, every bed on which she lies all the days of her discharge shall be to her as the bed of her impurity. Everything on which she sits shall be unclean, as in the uncleanness of her menstrual impurity. And whoever touches these things shall be unclean, and shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water, and be unclean until the evening. Now, when you actually think about when these laws were first put into place, and then as well, even in Jesus' time, which is some few thousands of years later, when these laws were first put in place, the Jews, the people of Israel, were actually living in tents out in the wilderness. So you can look at this and you can understand it's a hygiene thing, right? There's no running water. They're living, I imagine it was cheek by jowl, right? And so to me, it really makes sense. Yes, if there's blood around, someone is going to be classed as unclean simply from the perspective of hygiene. And you can understand, right? Sickness can get passed through blood. And so it says here, if you're touching someone who's bleeding, then you're unclean until the evening, which means you're not allowed to go and touch anyone else, and you should wash your clothes and anything else that's been touched by her. So I can understand like where that kind of idea and that law has come from. But here, right, in Jesus' time, we've got this woman, she has been bleeding for 12 years. And she had suffered many things from many physicians. She'd spent all that she had and was not only no better, but she grew worse. I actually feel quite teary talking about this because I just think, like what a life she must have had. I imagine that she would have been well known to the people around her, that they would have avoided her because she would constantly be in a state of uncleanness. She would not be able to touch anyone else without them becoming unclean. Right? And the Jews at that time, a lot of them were very, very, certainly like the scribes and the Pharisees, the people that were leading the Jewish religion of the time, were very, very strict about imposing their laws. And they put laws upon laws, which I'm sure we'll cover in the future. They really bound the people up with extra laws just to make sure that the actual law, God's word, wasn't broken. And here you've got this woman for 12 years. She has just suffered and suffered and suffered. She's pretty much lost everything that she's had, and she's just gotten worse and worse and worse. And you can imagine she's heard about this Jesus, right? And she's like, she knew if she touched him that she would make him unclean. So can you imagine what she will have had to overcome in herself, right? Not just to touch Jesus, but it says here, a great multitude is following Jesus and thronging him. Thronging him. So if you've ever been in a huge crowd, you know what that's like. There's people just pressed in from every side. So I can imagine that she is probably almost hiding away in her clothes. She'll have like probably a veil up over her face. She will probably be looking around, making sure no neighbours or anyone has seen her enter the crowd. Because if they're thronging, and you listen to how the disciples are like, excuse me, because Jesus is like, someone's touched me. And the disciples are like, are you serious? Like, the crowd is thronging you and you're saying someone touched you. So we know with a crowd thronging, there is just going to be touching. Everyone's going to be like jostling and coming up against one another. And she is like making her way to Jesus. Like, that is just absolute faith. She's heard about him and she's like, nothing is going to come between me and touching Jesus. And you think like, she must have been like it says, faith born in desperation, but I can just imagine how hopeless her life must have felt to have just bled and bled and bled for 12 years and for things to get worse and worse. And You know what it's like when you're suffering from something and you go to the doctor and you expect for it to be made better, and instead it says here it just got worse. She'd spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. And here she is, and she's like, he is not even going to know that I've touched him. Look at this crowd thronging around. I'm going to reach out and touch him. And here's what I find I find two things really fascinating. So one, like when she reaches out and touches him, like such is her faith that immediately, right, upon touching the hem of his garment, she can feel like that her affliction has been healed. I think that is amazing in and of itself. Like that I can just imagine the absolute wash of like relief, but like it's not a wash of, I mean, absolutely she would have felt relief, but I can just, well, it's interesting actually because Jesus says to her, go in peace. But what I was thinking was, I guarantee that when that healing came upon her and it says she felt it in her body, I think her whole body was probably suffused with an incredible feeling of peace and vitality. And I just think, to me, like that was Jesus's healing power, was that he wasn't like, oh, you know, that's your problem, I'll just give you just enough to not have that problem anymore. I bet like he just would have given like full health and vitality, like incredible well-being. But what I find also, so first of all, that she feels it through her whole body, but also that Jesus, it says here, immediately knowing in himself that power has gone out of him. And I find this really, really fascinating. Like, what was Jesus actually feeling in his body? Like, how did Jesus get around? Like, what was he actually feeling all the time to actually feel like his power going out of his body? Or yeah, so that in Luke says, I perceived power going out from me. And you know, because and to me I find like this so fascinating, the difference between just a touch. You've got people, a massive crowd thronging and jostling, and the disciples are like, you've got people banging up against you all the time, and those touches are doing nothing to Jesus. But this faith filled touch, right, this, the hem of the garment, she just touched it and he could feel that. And I just find that incredible. The discernment in his body, in his spirit, between a jostling touch that meant nothing and a faith-filled touch born of desperation. I find that incredible. But then what I love, right? So he's looking around, he's like, someone touched me, right? So we've got this whole crowd going to the house of Jairus, the leader of the Jews, this important person, everyone's on the way, like, there's stories about Jesus. You can imagine, like, there's noise and bustling and crowd like this, and he just stops. And of course, everyone is going to be like, whoa, like this person we're following, like, has stopped. It's a little bit Pied Pipery, isn't it? The leader has stopped. Everyone's going to be like, what's going on? She is fearing and trembling, right? She knows what's happened. She knows it was her, that it was her touch, because she's felt the difference in her body. And she came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And you can imagine, because there would have been a part of her filled with fear, like, I have been unclean, and this, like, Jesus was known not just as a healer, but he's called Rabboni, which means teacher. He's talked about as even, that they're like, how can he speak with so much wisdom, given that he hasn't had teaching? Jesus' reputation is pretty up there, and she has been unclean. She's been unable to touch anyone for 12 years without making them unclean. So can you imagine how she is feeling, thinking in her head, I have made this incredible, powerful leader on the way to the leader of a synagogue's house. I've made him unclean. Now, under the law, if he was made unclean, right, he was not allowed to touch anyone for the rest of the day, and he would have had to go and wash all of his clothes. Instead, she was healed. I think like that, it talks about Jesus, how he came to fulfill the law. And so much of what he does seems like it's outside of the law, was outside of what the law allowed, and yet like it wasn't. And so what does he say to her? Daughter, like he calls her daughter straight away. That's like there's relationship there, isn't there? Your faith has made you well. And to me, this just shows the importance of faith. Something like the belief, like Hebrews tells us that faith is believing in something that you cannot see. And here, she has had faith. That touch, right, is because she had faith. If she had just followed Jesus and jostled up against him in the crowd, nothing would have happened. It was actually her belief that something would change when she touched him that allowed that to occur. Her faith has made her well. And then he says, go in peace. And I think, yeah, that is the gift. And interesting, I looked up that word peace earlier on today, and it has got actually an implication of prosperity in there, which I didn't actually know. And I find that really interesting as well, given that she has basically beggared herself to try and heal herself and just got worse and worse. And here she is out of faithful desperation. And he not only touches her in a way that she feels throughout her whole entire body, he also says, go in peace. And I think about that as like maintaining that feeling that she would have felt, that whole sense of vitality. Like he didn't just heal her physically. He would have healed, like imagine the emotional burden of for 12 years, right? Carrying around this uncleanness. And like I'm highlighting at the start, it's a hygiene issue, right? There's no running water, it's hot. You even think about, if you're bleeding now, I mean, I think period undies are an incredible thing, right? They didn't have that back then. And you think about like the realities of bleeding with like the lack of access to the types of things that we have here. And like the burden that would have put on any relationships she'd have had to isolate herself so much, I think, the emotional impact of that isolation, of carrying this around, like the desperation, the hopelessness. So Jesus doesn't just like heal the physical. Jesus is like, I'm healing you on all levels. I'm going to heal like your mental, your physical, your emotional, your spiritual affliction, right? I'm making you whole. And actually, I think potentially, I was going to say, I feel like one of them said about being made whole. No, the woman was made well. This one says, this is in Matthew, be of good cheer, daughter. And in Luke, Luke as well echoes that, daughter, be of good cheer. Your faith has made you well. Go in peace. And I love that. Like he met her where she was at and embraced her, right? Embraced her faith and sent her away better than how she arrived. And I just love it. I really love it. And in contrast, like I said, we've got that contrast of he's going to Jairus's house, the ruler of the synagogue. On the way, the daughter's super, super sick. Who stops him on the way? The lowest of the low, someone who's been unclean, a woman, no less, unclean for 12 years. And then you can imagine how Jairus is feeling, like, come on, like, what have you stopped for? Like this. And then while he's still speaking, this is while Jesus is still speaking to the woman and saying, like, your faith has made you whole, like, go in peace. Again, I love the fact that it's got that like prosperity kind of wrapped up in it. And some came from the ruler of the synagogue's house and said, your daughter is dead, why are you troubling the teacher any further? Imagine how Jairus would have felt, like just put out with this unclean woman. Like, why did you, if the teacher had come sooner, like my daughter would have been saved. Interestingly, and I'm not going to go further into it now. So Jesus says to Jairus, do not be afraid, only believe. And it says, he goes on to the house and says the child was not dead but sleeping. And they ridiculed him, but I'm not going to go into that now. But I think like one final thought, because I've been thinking about peace and thinking about like so many people in life seem to, like lots of people is kind of striving to be happy. Are you happy? Like striving for happiness, I think has long been a thing. And I kind of think life is always going to be filled with like challenges and good times, you know, and happiness I feel is something that is not ever going to be a constant, whereas peace, a feeling of peace, I think definitely can be. And a verse that I think about a lot, and I'm sure I'm going to come back to many times, is in Philippians 4. And it talks about the peace of God. It says here, the Lord is at hand. Do not be anxious about anything. So again, thinking about this woman, right? This desperate woman. Don't be anxious, right? But in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Right? In this one here, the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. And I think that's the peace that Jesus was saying to this woman. Like, go in peace, feel that peace, right? It surpasses all understanding. And I've gotten to places in my life where I've felt that. It feels incredible to have an absolute sense of equanimity. Like, it doesn't matter what happens. It's like my anchor is something that is just going to hold me firm and steady. And, you know, there can be challenges and there can be good times, but peace, an underlying peace like that passes all understanding, that keeps our hearts and our minds, like that is an absolute gift, and one that like we should all strive for. And I think like it's available to us. It is available. But, you know, I think this speaks to when we get desperate and when we feel like everything is hopeless. The hem of Jesus's garment is where it's at. Like, we have got to push through all the things that we feel like could be standing in our way, right? That going out into a crowd, I think like how much she would have had to overcome mentally, right, to make herself do it. Imagine how fearful she would have felt. I can just imagine, so afraid that someone would see her and call her out for it. What do you think you're doing going into the crowd? You're going to make all of these people unclean, right? Think of the burden that she could have put on all of those people. And yet, like, she pushed through all of that. She was like, I am so desperate. I'm not going to let that stand in my way. I'm going to reach out and touch that hem. And she was rewarded for it. And I love it. And like I say, it gives me lots to think about Jesus and about not only him in relationship, him calling her a daughter, but actually what was the feeling he had in his body? To be able to differentiate between a jostling touch and a healing touch. When my virtue has gone out of me, or my power. I think it's the King James Version that says virtue. Anyway, those are my thoughts for today. Thanks for joining me. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, and I'll be back with another video exploring more of like faith and life and all of those juicy things. Bye.